Hi, everybody. Wednesday is Earth Day, a day to appreciate and protect this precious planet we call home. And today, there's no greater threat to our planet than climate change.
So Obama's talking about all of this with the global warming and that, and a lot of it's a hoax. It's a hoax. I mean, it's a money-making industry, okay? It's a hoax.
This is now a clear global problem. The absolute consensus is that human action is leading to an increase in average temperatures. Absolute consensus.
You know, when you hear, for instance, a scientist saying the science is settled, you know that person has stepped out of the science. And whenever you see someone say, you know, instead of answering arguments, how could so many people agree if it weren't true? It should be a red flag.
Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 3 in this Enviro-Imperialism series, where I've been examining different ways in which environmentalism is co-opted to serve corporate and imperialistic forces. A green mask of empire, if you will. Over the past 2 episodes, I've looked at how nature conservation is employed to create artificial scarcity and push up the prices of resources, as well as a form of ethnic cleansing, driving indigenous people off their land. I have speculated as to how these same forces might play out in the big one, global warming, and I'm now going to begin to look at that directly. In this episode, I'll make a start by simply going over the history of climate science as it pertains to global warming. It's very rare that I hear a discussion on climate that's rooted in historical contexts, and it certainly left me wondering where these ideas came from and how they've developed. In subsequent episodes, I'll attempt to critique the broad anthropogenic global warming narrative from a variety of different angles. It is, I think, well worth taking the time to understand the strength of the AGW claim as fully as possible. To quote John Stuart Mill, he who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. Okay, our story starts in the 1820s with French scientist Jean-Baptiste Joseph Fourier. Fourier was an expert on heat transfer. He calculated, given what was known at the time about the temperature of the sun and how far away it was, that the Earth should be considerably colder than it actually is. He then proposed various ways to account for this, thinking it might be due to additional radiation from space. He also considered that the Earth's atmosphere may have an insulating property. This insight made him the first person to recognize what we now call the greenhouse effect. Fourier referenced an experiment where glass sheets were placed inside a vase that had been lined with black cork. When sunlight entered the vase, it was observed that the bottom compartment, under the most sheets of glass, became the hottest. Fourier speculated that the atmosphere may have this kind of effect. The following decade, another French physicist, Claude Pouillet, speculated that a combination of water vapor and carbon dioxide could be responsible for this insulating effect. In the 1850s, English scientist John Tyndall proved the greenhouse effect experimentally. He demonstrated that water vapor, carbon dioxide, and methane all absorb infrared radiation, writing that, quote, "When the heat is absorbed by the planet, it is so changed in quality that the rays emanating from the planet cannot get with the same freedom back into space. Thus the atmosphere admits of the entrance of solar heat, but checks its exit, and the result is a tendency to accumulate heat at the surface of the planet." End quote. The first person to suggest that the burning of fossil fuels might add to the greenhouse effect was Swedish scientist Svante August Arrhenius. In the 1890s, Arrhenius was working on a theory to explain the ice ages, which scientists had recently concluded periodically took place. He calculated an estimate of how much increasing atmospheric carbon dioxide would affect the surface temperature of the Earth. In doing so, he concluded that human activity was substantial enough to affect the temperature. This isn't just a direct effect, but that the CO2-induced warming would change the level of water vapor, which would have a far more substantial effect. Arrhenius estimated that a doubling of CO2 levels would raise the Earth's temperature by approximately 4 degrees Celsius. He wasn't in the least bit worried about this, however, believing that a hotter planet would be a good thing which would insulate us from the next ice age. If you think about it, Humans had just discovered that every now and then the temperature of the Earth plummets and everything freezes. That's a terrifying thought when it seems it's completely beyond our control. Arrhenius thought that releasing carbon would save everyone in the Northern Hemisphere from having to move to Africa the next time this happened. He wrote that, quote, "By the influence of the increasing percentage of carbonic acid in the atmosphere, we may hope to enjoy ages with more equitable and better climates, especially as regards the colder regions of the Earth, ages where the Earth will bring forth much more abundant crops than at present, for the benefit of rapidly propagating mankind." End quote. It was later concluded that CO2 does not drive ice ages, rather it is the orbit of the Earth, with carbon having an amplifying effect. Arrhenius's predictions on anthropogenic CO2 were largely ignored for 50 years, due to a general skepticism that human activity could really affect the climate. It was also assumed that carbon would be absorbed by the oceans. There were a couple of notable exceptions, with the magazine Popular Mechanics running an article in 1912 which read, quote, "It has been found that if the air contained more carbon dioxide, which is the product of the combustion of coal or vegetable material, the temperature would be somewhat higher. Since burning coal produces carbon dioxide, it may be inquired whether the enormous use of the fuel in modern times may not be an important factor in filling the atmosphere with this substance, and consequently indirectly raising the temperature of the Earth." End quote. Popular Mechanics are quite proud that they were so far ahead of the curve on this today. In the 1930s, an English steam engineer, Guy Stewart Callender, compiled measurements of both temperature and CO2. He was the first person to show temperature had risen over the previous 50 years, and he correlated this with a rise in CO2. Like Arrhenius, Callender also thought this warming would be beneficial, delaying a return of the deadly glaciers. Whilst disbelieved at the time, his work built the momentum which would ultimately lead to the acceptance of anthropogenic global warming. In the 1950s, scientist Charles David Keeling finally confirmed Arrhenius's predictions. Keeling developed the first instrument capable of reliably measuring carbon dioxide levels in the air. He first established that CO2 exhibited a strong seasonal variation, with northern hemisphere levels peaking in the winter, then falling away again in the spring due to plant growth. Keeling then demonstrated that CO2 levels were increasing over time, on what came to be known as the Keeling curve. His research has ultimately shown that the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide has grown from 315 parts per million in 1958 to 427 ppm today. On the basis of his work, in 1963, the US National Science Foundation issued a warning regarding rapidly increasing amounts of heat-trapping gases. It is after this point, when the increases in CO2 could be reliably measured year on year, the concern really mounted up. At a 1959 symposium organized by the American Petroleum Institute, father of the hydrogen bomb, physicist Edward Teller, said that, quote, "I am to talk to you about energy in the future. I will start by telling you why I believe that the energy resources of the past must be supplemented. And this, strangely, is the question of contaminating the atmosphere. Whenever you burn conventional fuel, you create carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide has a strange property. It transmits visible light, but it absorbs the infrared radiation which is emitted from the Earth. Its presence in the atmosphere causes a greenhouse effect. It has been calculated that a temperature rise corresponding to a 10% increase in carbon dioxide will be sufficient to melt the ice cap and submerge New York. All the coastal cities will be covered, and since a considerable percentage of the human race lives in coastal regions, I think that this chemical contamination is more serious than most people tend to believe." End quote. In the 1960s, it was discovered that, in between the 4 major ice ages that were known about, many shorter ones had occurred. The theory that these ice ages were primarily driven by small shifts in the Earth's orbit, known as Milankovitch cycles, became prominent. This heightened the concern that the climate may be sensitive to small changes. These fears were compounded in the 1980s, when studying Greenland ice cores revealed evidence that the Earth's temperature could oscillate wildly inside a single century. Also in the 1960s, scientists Sakuro Manabe and Richard Weatherall used computers to predict a doubling of carbon would lead to an approximate 2 degrees Celsius increase in global temperature. Crucially, this prediction is based on other factors, such as cloud cover, remaining constant. Also in the 1960s, measurements of the world's temperature through weather stations were sufficiently compiled to show an increase from the 1880s through to the 1940s, with a cooling trend then setting in. This cooling period has been attributed to the heavy pollution of the time, with Paul Ehrlich writing in his 1968 book, The Population Bomb, quote, "The greenhouse effect is being enhanced now by the greatly increased level of carbon dioxide. This is being countered by low-level clouds generated by contrails, dust, and other contaminants. At the moment, we cannot predict what the overall climate result will be of our using the atmosphere as a garbage dump." End quote. Predictions of catastrophe now became commonplace. A memorandum to the Nixon White House spoke of 10-foot sea level rises by the year 2000, saying, "Goodbye New York, goodbye Washington for that matter." NATO established a hub of research into various environmental issues, including the greenhouse effect. Scientists became concerned about the possibility of warmer temperatures setting off a runaway positive feedback. For example, if polar ice decreases due to rising CO2, the planet loses its highly reflective effect, thus bringing on further warming. Politically, in 1988, the United Nations Environmental Programme and the World Meteorological Organization jointly established the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the famous IPCC. The United Nations Conference on Environment and Development was first held in 1992, and at its third meeting in 1997, it passed the legally binding Kyoto Protocol. This required more developed countries to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 5% from 1990 levels between 2008 and 2012. At the time of recording, the 45th and 7th President of the United States has just withdrawn the country from the 2015 Paris Agreement for the second time. That brings us well into the modern era and concludes this whistle-stop tour. I've presented the narrative uncritically for now, and I think it's easy to see why there's a compelling narrative of an ignored and repressed truth slowly gaining traction through the 20th century, battling scientific intransigence and short-sighted corporate greed as it does so. I think it's also easy to see why the basic science, more carbon equals more heat, is just so compelling, not to mention deeply concerning. Maybe I should go throw some soup over a painting. There are lots of angles from which this narrative could be critiqued. Most obviously is the science itself. Is it politicized in any way? How much do we really understand about something so complex as the climate? There's also the media's reporting on the science. Does it tend to sensationalize and catastrophize? Did we see an example of this with the global cooling scare of the 1970s? Additionally, there is the economic angle. Will tackling global warming ultimately cost vastly more human lives than ignoring it altogether? The burning of fossil fuels is perhaps the major thing separating us from the lifestyle of medieval serfs. There are also underpinning philosophical assumptions. What should the temperature of the Earth be? Are we acting from an intention to maximize human flourishing, or out of a concern to leave nature in some untouched state? And finally, there is the corporate imperial angle. Major corporations such as oil companies are typically presented as acting in opposition to any moves to curtail global warming. However, as we saw in the episode on the lumber industry, the truth is not always so simple. Are more sinister forces co-opting concern over global warming as a way of controlling world energy resources, and ultimately setting us all on the road back to serfdom? This is what I'll move into in subsequent episodes. Thank you for listening. If you wish to support the podcast, details of my subscription and buy me a coffee page are in the info box.